Ja, hallo, wir sind jetzt im nächsten.
Now here comes our next panel, where we're going to talk about the future of Europe. I would like to welcome the Austrian Federal Minister for the EU and Constitution. You have been the Minister for the EU since January 2020, after you've moved up, having a number of positions before. Now, as you took over that job, the COVID pandemic broke. Now, wasn't that strange that you would experience Europe in this time of crisis?
First of all, let me correct you. I became Minister for Europe in January 2020 when Corona was not something a lot of people talked about. And during the first weeks of my office as a Minister for EU and the Constitution, I visited a great number of capitals of Europe in order to be in touch with my counterparts. I toured 10 cities in 10 days, for example. That was in January, February, and then Corona came in. And what marked me a lot, what influenced me a lot, was that in the beginning of February, there was talk about a virus very far off, very far away. And just under a month later, we found ourselves in the midst of the first lockdown, and then everything changed. And then the coronavirus really made an imprint. And of course, it turned things upside down, and it demonstrated the shortcomings and the strength of Europe. And hopefully, and I'm an optimist, we see the pandemic fading away. We know a lot more people are getting vaccinated more and more. We know how to deal with the virus, and now we need to draw the lessons from this crisis. It's up to us to react now to make Europe more resilient. And in the future, and in the conference for the future of Europe, and I fought for that also before the virus, we have to have a dialogue with citizens.
Now we come back in a minute, but if you generally refer to your attitude towards Europe or EU, when we say Europe, we obviously mean the European Union. Do you think your attitude has been a more critical one now, or are you a fascinated or compassionate European because you have the feeling that something has worked?
I have always been a very passionate European, and I would even go a step further. If we didn't have Europe right now, we would have to invent it, because we've realized that on our own, we will not be able to overcome crises. In the course of last year, and last year in summer, we adopted the biggest budget of all times. We adopted EU Next Generation, the recovery plan, and we've realized that it's only when inspired by solidarity that we can find a way out of the crisis. But now we need to take a different look and look at what can be done differently. This is the lesson we need to draw, and we need to get started now.
Now, we're in Berlin here, and often in the larger countries, people refer to other large countries like Germany and France, the Italians and the Spaniards. But how would you see the role of Austria? Is Austria part of the drivers, really the inhibitors of more integration?
When it comes to the West Balkans, we are amongst the ones to be willing to promote this. And during our Council presidency in 2018, we made a call for taking a different stance towards the Western Balkans, making it move closer to European values. And it's more important than ever. And Austria is a medium-sized country, and we've demonstrated that we can speak with a strong voice in Europe. Sebastian Kurz certainly sorted that Austria is now perceived quite differently. And please think back to what happened last summer when it was about negotiating the budget. Then there was this coalition of the Frugal Four plus Finland, which is something I consider to be a positive thing, because we were able to show that even if you're a mid-sized country, you can get things going if you forge necessary alliances in the European Union. It's something deeply pro-European, because when we're around one table and negotiate about 27 different opinions, it's going to be difficult to find consensus. But when like-minded parties can move together, they can bring things forward.
Now, it's interesting you would say about integration and referring to enlargement. European enlargement, and actually this is shedding some light on the position of Austria in this debate. Just now you referred to the Frugal Four. That really was the term that has been coined because it sounds good. Frugal Four means it's a positive connotation to it, but then there are others who say that Austrian is also a laggard when it comes to the integration. Enlargement, yes. And there's not really a big difference vis-à-vis Germany's position, because Germany also wants pre-accession assistance to the Western Balkans. But when it comes to integration, Austria has been hitting the brake more often than not. And I'm sorry when I say that and add, the Southern Europeans would say, when it comes to money and integration.
Well, you have to define what integration and migration is all about. When it's about integration, we believe we need an overall solution for migration. No state on its own will be able to solve the migratory issue, but we're against distributing all across Europe. We've experienced a major burden since 2015 when it comes to migratory flows, even coming to Austria. And this is something that we should be allowed to speak out loud. And we should also bear in mind and take into consideration. It's not us slowing things down, but it's a position for each and every country to be considered regarding what we've achieved so far. We must not hide here. And how can we get out of the crisis? We have to underline that we have to go on in solidarity, but each and every state has to do their own homework, and this is what we fought for. And the result is that we've now embarked upon this recovery plan, and you need to demonstrate and prove what the money is earmarked for. And this is the only way to assert ourselves in the world. Look at what's going on in China. Look at what's going on in the United States. And now our aim is to endeavor to the best of ourselves for our own sake. And we are well positioned, geographically speaking. We are positioned in the heart of Europe. And Austria has always built bridges towards the east. Now we're building bridges towards the West Balkans. And at the same time, we believe there should be something like subsidiarity.
So you wouldn't accept the term of being a laggard?
No, I wouldn't accept us slowing things down, no.
Lack of solidarity is what the Italians were saying in the debate. And it's also what other countries say about Austria who want a distribution of migrants. You wouldn't accept that?
No. Absolutely not. We are deeply pro-European. We're a medium-sized country providing a great deal for the European Union. We're a net payer for a very good reason, because we're well off, but we also want others to do their homework. I think this is a pro-European approach, and this is the only way for this project to stand a chance in the future. If it's not a situation where some spend the money given by others, but they have to also defend European values, and that's what we do. And let me once again highlight the example of the Frugal Four. Only if a solidarity action is borne by everyone, then it can pay off. And in a community of 27, we should negotiate things through.
Now, just now you refer to the Frugal Four. We also have the Visegrad groups or Scandinavian alliances who have joined forces. Now, is that something that you would think is a potential threat because it might divide Europe up? Or is it rather a counterbalance versus an exceedingly large dominance of Germany and France, who always seem to have bilateral agreements?
I believe a lot of things have changed since Brexit, and this has been on the horizon for quite a long time during the negotiations, and during our EU Council presidency, we put the Brexit on our daily agenda. So there is no such thing as three big countries, but there's France and Germany, two very influential and strong member states of the European Union, but there are also alliances of medium-sized and smaller countries. And I think this will also be the future of the European Union. Depending on the topic, depending on the subject at hand, you would go out and reach out to partners, and this doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, quite to the contrary, because this can lead to finding compromises more rapidly, because whenever more people speak with one voice, it's not 27 positions.
A general question on your future outlook on European integration. Are you a proponent of a confederation?
I think the European Union can only be as strong as its members are. And I am always following the slogan of being united in diversity. This can be our only motto. And I'm a realist. I wouldn't want us copying and pasting what we find in the United States, but what makes us strong is that we've got this diversity of states, of traditions, of languages, of living this diversity, which is also reflected in negotiations, by the way. And let me be quite frank, regardless of how we structure the European Union and how we use the results of the Conference on the Future of Europe, things will stay strenuous to find a common stance. But it's worth it. It's worthwhile because we have to live up to global constellations. We have to live up to China, Russia, the United States. We have to be taken seriously. This is why we have to have these discussions.
Now, just after this COVID pandemic, wouldn't that be an erroneous debate? Because some learning from COVID is that, something then needs to be done in healthcare, which is not mutualized, but you do more together mutually. Ordering vaccines, organizing travel. I mean, we see that every day. This is something that people talk about, the EU Green Certificate. I mean, obviously, there's a clear clarion call for doing more integration rather than less. You at one point said, or you criticized, that there's a reflexive assignment of competences to the EU, but isn't that what we need to talk about now in healthcare?
Let me stick to that. I mean, if it's a reflex transferring competencies to Brussels, then it would be the wrong way. We're strong member states, and there are things that are in our own hands, and there are things that have been shifted to the level of the European Union, but where we have to develop strength. You mentioned a number of things. Developing vaccines. This was the result of us working together strongly, deeply. Who would have thought that within less than a year we would be able to vaccinate so many people? And also procurement of goods and equipment. Well, this did not turn out that well in the face of the crisis, but let's look at how and where our competencies are and how to make good use of them. And then let's think about how we can shift things back to the national level. It's important to preserve subsidiarity of having things talked through within member states. And now, subsequently to the crises, or the idea of wanting to push health care matters to Brussels, I think is the wrong reflex. We should look at what doesn't work out right and improve it.
So transferring competences to Europe doesn't mean that the European Commission has the final say. But in many ways where you haven't negotiated about, obviously intergovernmental negotiations would still require you to act together. This is the way forward.
Yes, this is also the way forward with the green vaccination pass, and there are recommendations of the European Commission in a trilogue with the different nations and parliament. And we are currently in the midst of negotiations. I believe that states will also make use of these recommendations, and the best example was the Brexit strategy. We all had one goal to get out of this crisis, to give people back their freedoms. And I believe that this is something which is a good way to proceed. But depending on the geographical situations, member states can act as they like.
This praise from member state, isn't that in contradiction to your enlargement question? Because you were saying that the Western Balkan states should join. This process has always been protracted, although many say that the Western Balkans have already met the preconditions for pre-accession, and there have often been national debates in France and the Netherlands that were an impediment. But isn't that also generally an impediment for retaining Austrian targets within the EU?
This is a painstaking process when you have to try and convince again and again. But in the midst of the crisis in March of last year, we managed to convince member states, even those that were skeptical, that we should conclude accession negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania in March 2020. And now we also have a member state that, again, is very skeptical towards this, and they will not give their agreement to take the next step. And again, I believe it is very good to try and sit down and convince them. I know it was painful for the German Council presidency as well, and I also spoke with many colleagues over here, and the last step could not be taken during the German Council presidency, unfortunately, they said. But we are in the process of this, and if we look at the big picture, I think we can manage to do this, that we can convince everyone and get everyone on board like back then.
Now, before I get a question from the audience, let me ask a final one here on the future of the conference on the future of Europe. Don't you think the EU has to be more honest? Because on the one hand, governments have taken that decision, but what citizens and parliamentarians can do is only making proposals, and then the governments come in and they will decide whether or not to take up those proposals. Is that really the right way forward to boost confidence in Europe?
I believe this is dearly needed, that we involve citizens, because only if we have knowledge about the European Union and if we can answer the questions and concerns, we can create a European Union for our citizens. And this is a process which I kicked off last year in Austria already. I realize that there is a lot of knowledge, there are many interests, but we just need to get people on board. The conference on the future of Europe is sensational because all three institutions, for the first time, committed to implementing those ideas. But we're right at the start of the process, as you just said, and we have to make this happen.
So you wouldn't expect a big disappointment when the 27 governments come up with a decision proposal and say, we're not going to do it?
Well, if I'd expect a disappointment at the beginning of the process, I'd be in the wrong position as a politician. I'm an optimist, I'm positive, and I learned in Austria that people are really joining us with a lot of enthusiasm, and they make proposals to do with things that we were not even considering as a problem. And whenever we solve those problems, whenever we deliver, we prove that we build a European Union for our citizens.
Now, I'd like to take a question from the audience here, from Heinrich Kraft, from the Russia University of Budapest. In Europe, we have a number of laggards in foreign and security policy. Just yesterday, Hungary has rejected a joint position of the EU on Israel. What can Europe do in order to be able to do world politics, as Jean-Claude Juncker said?
This sounds like an easy answer, but it's difficult to implement. Europe needs to speak with one voice. And here, the person who asked the question needs to address something that should be the topic of a conference on the future. In the common security and foreign policy, how can we come faster with our positions? How can we prevent individual states from preventing us to make our voice heard? And we really need to question whether the principle of unanimity is always the best choice. And the example that was addressed is, of course, one example where this is about trying to really act fast and take up a position quickly, and it's painful that there is no agreement so far.
Something we haven't talked about is the relationship of large and smaller or medium-sized countries. Now, especially for unanimity, don't you think that is a problem? Because there's always smaller EU partners who are worried that if we get away with unanimity, it's only the big ones deciding.
I am not concerned about this because after the Brexit, smaller and medium-sized countries can also group for specific positions. But this is also an expression of the fact that we're all sovereign nation states and we want to remain sovereign states within the EU. So this is certainly something that we need to address in the future process without denying sovereignty to anyone. But maybe we can find different solutions, maybe different from unanimity, if you really want to demonstrate at the global level that you have a unified position.
Something like a European Security Council, as the German Chancellor said, with a rotating membership?
I don't want to anticipate how we solve this, but of course there are a number of proposals on the table, and I believe now is the time to discuss them.
And finally, let's go back to the question of the consequences of Brexit. You mentioned it, and you also said Brexit has led to a situation that many countries who have hid behind the UK now speak up with their own positions, and which is a good thing because it makes negotiations a bit more complex, but it makes individual positions clearer. And now in 2022, we expect elections coming up in France and Italy. Are you concerned that we're going to get another Brexit debate?
I am not very concerned because the Brexit process was very painful for the European Union. The EU 27 have moved closer together in the position vis-à-vis the United Kingdom, so I believe that we will still have a close relationship with the United Kingdom in the field of research and science. We also have connections that we will still want to maintain and nurture. But precisely because it was so difficult, because there were so many questions to answer, it demonstrated to many countries that the tendency of exiting the EU leads to more difficulties than it is winning those countries' gains. And I also think that for the UK itself, it is very painstaking.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I now would like to introduce Ms. Vedelko.